The morning Georgia Brooks was thrown out of the only home she had ever known. The sky above Caldwell, Kansas, was the precise shade of a bruise. She stood in the dirt road with nothing but a carpetbag she had packed in the dark, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely grip the worn leather handle. And she listened to the heavy oak door of the Aldridge house slam shut behind her with a finality that felt like a judge's gavel coming down on the last hope she had ever permitted herself to carry. She was 23 years old, and she had never, not once in her entire life, held a single thing in this world that belonged to her alone. It had not always seemed like a tragedy. When you grow up in a house that belongs to someone else, eating food bought with someone else's money, wearing dresses sewn from fabric chosen by someone else's hands, you learn early that ownership is a word that applies to other people. Georgia had been 7 years old when the fever took both her parents in the same terrible week, and the county had sent her to live with her mother's distant cousin, Vera Aldridge, a narrow-faced woman who accepted Georgia the way a person accepts a piece of furniture they did not order but cannot return. Georgia was fed. Georgia was clothed. Georgia was put to work in the house from the time she was old enough to hold a broom, and she told herself every single morning for 16 years that this was enough. That gratitude was its own kind of home. But Vera Aldridge's son, Harold, had come back from 2 years in Wichita with a new wife and a baby on the way and opinions about space. And Georgia had been informed over supper the previous evening that her presence in the household was no longer required. Vera had said it without cruelty, which was almost worse than if she had said it with it. She had said it the way a person says that the season has turned and the old coat no longer fits. Matter of fact, finished. Georgia had not cried. She had gone upstairs, packed the few things that were actually hers, which amounted to 2 dresses, a Bible that had been her mother's, a small hand mirror with a crack across one corner, and a hair ribbon of faded blue silk, and she had come downstairs at first light and walked out the door before anyone else in the house was awake, because she refused to be watched leaving. Now she stood in the street in the early September morning of 1882, with the sun just beginning to drag itself over the flat horizon, and she breathed in slowly, and she thought about what came next. Caldwell was a cattle town, positioned right at the Kansas Indian Territory border, and it was loud and rough and full of cowboys and cattlemen and merchants and gamblers even in the early hours. Georgia had lived here all her life, but had seen very little of it beyond the Aldridge house and the church and the mercantile. She walked toward the center of town because she did not know where else to walk, and she told herself that a woman with 2 strong hands and 16 years of keeping a house was not a woman without options. She found the options considerably fewer than she had hoped. The hotel had a position for a laundress, but the woman behind the desk looked at Georgia's carpetbag and the uncertainty in her face, and told her the room and board that came with the job would not be available for another 2 weeks. The dress shop was not hiring. The milliner was not hiring. The general store already had a girl. Georgia sat down on a bench outside the telegraph office and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and tried to think past the fear that was sitting in her chest like a stone. It was while she was sitting there, very still and very determined not to show anything on her face, that she heard the commotion coming from the direction of the livery stable. The sound was a horse, first of all. A big one, judging by the thundering quality of the hooves, and it was not happy. There were men's voices shouting, and then a crash, and then the horse came bolting out of the alley beside the livery with its saddle half hanging off one side, and its eyes white-trimmed with terror, heading straight down the main street of Caldwell at a gallop that suggested it had absolutely no intention of stopping for anything. People scattered. A woman screamed and grabbed a child off the boardwalk. A man dove into a doorway. Georgia stood up from her bench. She did not think about it. That was the thing she would remember later, how she simply did not think about it at all. She stepped off the boardwalk into the street and she spread her arms wide and she positioned herself directly in the horse's path, and she made herself as large and as still as she could make herself, and she said, very firmly and very quietly, "Easy now. Easy." The horse tried to veer around her. She stepped with it, blocking the turn, her arms still wide, her voice still steady, speaking in the low, even tone she had used her whole life on the Aldridge's nervous hound dog when it got spooked by thunderstorms. "I see you. I see you, big one. Easy now. Easy." The horse slowed. It was breathing hard, its whole body trembling, foam flecking along its neck, and it stopped 3 feet in front of her with its nostrils flaring and regarded her with one enormous dark eye. "There you are," Georgia said quietly. "There you are. Nobody's going to hurt you." She reached out slowly and took hold of the loose rein that was trailing in the dirt, and the horse let her. There was a long silence from the gathered crowd, and then someone started to clap, and then several people were clapping, and Georgia felt heat rise into her face, and she focused very deliberately on smoothing the horse's forelock back from between its eyes. "That is," said a voice behind her, rough-edged and slow with surprise, "the most remarkable thing I have seen in a considerable while." She turned. The man standing at the entrance to the alley was tall in the particular way of men who had grown up working outdoors, where height becomes something functional rather than ornamental. He had dark hair and dark eyes, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same hard limestone that jutted out of the creek bed south of town. He was maybe 28 years old, maybe a little more, and he was holding a lead rope in one hand and a crumpled hat in the other, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately name. It was somewhere between astonishment and something else, something more careful, as if he was not quite certain yet that what he was seeing was real. "Is he yours?" Georgia asked. She was still holding the rein. "He is," the man said. He walked toward her slowly enough not to spook the horse again. "August Hunter, and I am genuinely sorry about the fright. The cinch strap broke and he panicked before I could get a hold of him." "Georgia Brooks," she said. "He is not badly hurt. Scared is all." August Hunter came up beside her and ran his hand along the horse's neck with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a great deal of his life in the company of horses, and the animal pressed into his palm with a trust that told Georgia everything she needed to know about how the man treated the things in his care. "He will be fine," August agreed. He looked at her. "You have a way with horses." "I have a way with frightened things in general," Georgia said, which she had not intended to say out loud, and she felt that heat come back into her face again. Something shifted in August Hunter's expression. He looked at her carpetbag, sitting where she had left it against the bench outside the telegraph office, and then he looked at her face, and she saw him take in the careful composure she was wearing like armor, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was reading something she had not meant to write. "Can I buy you a cup of coffee?" he asked. "Least I can do, considering Ranger here nearly ran you down." Georgia considered declining. She was very good at declining things, at making herself small and taking up less space and needing less than she was actually permitted to need. But she was also hungry, having not eaten since supper the previous evening, and something about the straightforward honesty in this man's face made the armor feel, for just a moment, unnecessary. "All right," she said. They went to the small cafe on the far end of the main street, and August tied Ranger to the post outside with the careful attention of someone who does not take a horse's trust for granted, and they sat down across from each other at a table near the window, and the woman who ran the place brought them coffee without being asked, which told Georgia that August Hunter was a regular and a known quantity in this town. "You're passing through?" Georgia asked because she knew most people in Caldwell and she did not know him. "Not exactly," he said. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I have a ranch, about 12 miles southeast of here, just over the line, not large, 160 acres, a house, a barn, a creek that runs good most of the year. I come into town for supplies and the occasional visit to the land office." He paused. "You?" "I live here," she said. And then, because something in the way he had asked felt like a genuine question rather than a social formality, She added, "I have lived here my whole life, though as of this morning my circumstances have changed somewhat." She had not planned to say that either. She was not accustomed to saying things she had not planned, and she found it unsettling and also very slightly relieving. August looked at her over the rim of his cup. He did not ask the prying follow-up question that most people would have asked. Instead, he said, "What do you want to do?" Georgia blinked. It was such a simple question, and it had never once in her life been directed at her with this particular quality of genuine interest behind it. What do you want to do? Not what will you do, not what should you do, not what can you manage. What do you want? "I want to work," she said. "I want to earn my own way. I want something that is mine." She heard herself say the last part and felt exposed in a way that made her want to take it back. But August Hunter was nodding slowly as if what she had said was not strange at all, as if wanting something of your own was the most reasonable thing in the world. "I am looking for someone to help run the house," he said. He said it carefully, in a way that was clearly trying not to sound like what it might sound like. "I have been on that ranch alone for 2 years, and I am considerably better with cattle than with any of the domestic side of things. I have a spare room. I can offer room and board and wages." Georgia looked at him. She had been raised to be cautious, especially around men, especially in circumstances like these, and she was cautious. She studied his face. "Tell me about yourself," she said. He seemed to appreciate that she asked rather than simply accepting or declining. He told her. He had grown up in Texas, near San Antonio, on a cattle ranch that had belonged to his father. He had come north with a cattle drive at the age of 22, which would have been 6 years ago, and had fallen in love with the Kansas grassland with the particular devotion of a man who finds the place that fits him and knows immediately that it fits. He had worked as a hired hand for 3 years to save enough money to buy his own land, and he had been on it for 2 years. He had a small herd, 40 head, and he ran it himself with occasional hired help during the busy seasons. He had no family in the area. "No wife?" Georgia asked because it needed to be asked. "No wife," he said without any evasion in it. "There was a woman back in Texas a long time ago. She married someone else." He said it the way you say something that was once painful and is now simply a fact. "And you? Is there someone who is going to have a problem with you taking a position on a ranch?" "There is no one," Georgia said. They looked at each other across the table in the small cafe in Caldwell, Kansas in the early September morning of 1882, and there was something in the air between them that was not yet love but was the particular quality of attention that love grows from, the way a field looks in early spring before anything has broken through the surface yet. "I would need to understand clearly what is expected," Georgia said. "Housekeeping," he said. "Cooking. I can provide supplies. The room is private with a door that locks, and I will give you the key the day you arrive and never ask for it back." The door that locks. She thought about that. She thought about 16 years of sleeping in a room that was Vera Aldridge's room, that she only occupied, that she could have been removed from at any moment and indeed had been. A room with a door that locked was more than she had ever had. "I accept," Georgia Brooks said. The ride out to the Hunter Ranch took most of the morning. August had a wagon in addition to Ranger, and Georgia sat up on the bench beside him with her carpetbag at her feet and watched the town of Caldwell fall away behind them and the great flat reach of the Kansas grassland open up in every direction, until it felt like being on the deck of a ship in a green and gold ocean. The September grass was beginning to go bronze at the tips, and the sky was enormous, and the wind was warm and smelled like dry earth and something clean. August Hunter did not talk over much, which she appreciated. He pointed things out occasionally. A hawk riding the thermals above a cottonwood grove, the dark line of the creek that marked the northern boundary of his property, the way the light hit the grass in the late morning and made it look as if the whole prairie was breathing. "It is beautiful," Georgia said, before she could consider whether she was expected to say anything. "Yes," he agreed, and the way he said it was simple and certain. the way you agree with something that is simply and certainly true. The house was small but solid. 2 rooms downstairs, 2 rooms up. The outside was weathered wood that needed paint, and the porch had a board that needed replacing, and the kitchen garden was gone completely to weeds. But the bones of it were good, and Georgia could see, the way you see potential in a thing, that it had the makings of something worth caring for. He showed her the spare room, upstairs at the far end of the hall from his own. It had a window that faced east, a bed with a good mattress and a quilt that had clearly been made by someone's grandmother, a washstand, and a small chest of drawers. It was the finest room Georgia Brooks had ever had to herself. He handed her the key. She looked at it lying in the center of her palm, a small iron thing, ordinary and unremarkable, and she felt something happen in her chest that she could not quite identify, some cracking open of something that had been sealed shut for a very long time. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady but only barely. "I will leave you to settle in," August said, and he was already turning toward the stairs. "Noon meal is whenever you are ready. There is salt pork and cornmeal and dried beans in the kitchen, and the eggs are wherever the chickens left them this morning." Georgia unpacked her carpetbag into the chest of drawers. 2 dresses, a Bible, a cracked mirror, a blue silk ribbon. She arranged them with the care of someone who has very little and therefore understands precisely the value of each thing. Then she locked the door from the inside and stood in the center of the room and listened to the silence, which was not empty the way silence in a house full of people who do not want you can be empty. It was the silence of space, of room. She pressed her hand flat against the wall. This wall, right now, was hers. This room was hers. This key was hers. She stood there for a long moment. Then she went downstairs to find the eggs. The first days had a careful formality to them, the way 2 people feel around each other when they are still learning the shape of each other's presence. Georgia woke before dawn and had breakfast ready by the time August came in from the morning chores. She cooked well, which was perhaps the only purely personal satisfaction she had ever derived from all those years of work in the Aldridge house, because Vera Aldridge had let her do the cooking once she was old enough and had never interfered with it, possibly because she recognized that Georgia had a genuine gift for it. August Hunter ate everything she put in front of him with a thoroughness and appreciation that was, Georgia found, enormously satisfying. He did not take it for granted. He said thank you every single meal, and he meant it every single time, and that was different from what she was used to. She cleaned the house, which took the better part of the first week because the dust had gotten into everything, and the windows had not been properly washed in what looked like years. She mended what needed mending. She cleared the kitchen garden of weeds and planted a late crop of winter turnips and kale, because the season still had enough warmth left in it to get something established before the cold came. She repaired the broken porch board herself with tools she found in the barn, because it needed doing, and she saw no reason to wait. August came around the corner of the house and found her kneeling on the porch with a hammer on a Wednesday afternoon and stopped short with an expression of genuine surprise. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," Georgia said. She drove the last nail home. "I wanted to." He looked at the repair, which was clean and solid. He looked at her. "Where did you learn carpentry?" "Necessity," she said, and watching carefully. There was a pause, and then he smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile fully, not the small courteous expressions he had been giving her across the breakfast table, but a real one that reached his eyes and changed his whole face into something that she was unprepared for. She turned back to the porch and collected the extra nails and told herself that her pulse was elevated because of the physical effort of the work. They fell into a rhythm. It was the natural rhythm of 2 people who are both accustomed to working without complaint, and it was comfortable in the way that comfort between people can be when it is not forced. She managed the house. He managed the cattle and the land. They met at the table 3 times a day, and sometimes in the evenings they sat on the repaired porch and watched the light leave the sky and talked. The talking was the thing that surprised her most. She had not expected to have things to say, or rather, she had not expected to have anyone interested in hearing them. But August Hunter asked questions the way some people breathe, habitually and with full attention, and she found herself saying things she had never said to anyone. About her parents, both gone so young, about the 16 years in the Aldridge house, about the particular quality of invisibility that comes from being dependent, from never owning anything, from always being one decision away from having the floor pulled out from under you. He listened. He did not offer platitudes or solutions. He just listened, and sometimes he said something simple and honest in response, and that was enough, more than enough. It was the most she had been listened to in her entire life. He told her things too, about Texas, about his father, a complicated man who had been proud and difficult and loving in the way of men who do not know how to say the thing directly and so say it sideways, through long days of work done together and horses gifted on birthdays, about the cattle drive north which had been brutal and beautiful in equal measure, about the loneliness of the ranch which he admitted without drama or self-pity, simply as a fact of the life he had chosen. "Did you mind it?" Georgia asked one evening. "The loneliness?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark prairie where the stars were beginning to emerge. "I minded it more than I let myself think about," he said. "I think I got very good at not thinking about it." Georgia understood that completely. The trouble came, as trouble in 1882, Kansas had a way of coming, in the form of a man on a horse. His name was Roland Fitch, and he was a land speculator out of Wichita who had been quietly buying up acreage south of Caldwell for 2 years, accumulating enough that people had started to pay attention. He rode onto the Hunter ranch on a bright October morning with 2 men behind him, and a look on his face that Georgia had seen before, the look of a person who has decided that what is yours is actually theirs, and is only here to make the paperwork catch up with the decision. Georgia was in the kitchen garden. August was in the near pasture. She watched the 3 men ride in, and she set down her trowel and wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the fence. "Morning," she said. Roland Fitch looked at her with the particular brand of dismissiveness that men of his type directed at women who had the audacity to speak to them first. "I am here to see the owner," he said. "I will go get him," Georgia said pleasantly, and did. She came back with August, who had clearly seen something in her expression when she arrived at the pasture gate, because his own face was very still and very watchful by the time they reached the yard. Fitch made his offer. It was not a good one. He said the land market was changing, that the cattle business was getting harder, that a man running 40 head on 160 acres was a man who was going to find himself in trouble in 2 or 3 years, and that he was offering a way out. He named a number that was less than half what the land was worth. August Hunter listened to all of this with the patient stillness of a man who has worked cattle in high winds and knows how to wait out a thing. "No," he said when Fitch was finished. Fitch's expression shifted. Not dramatically, nothing theatrical, just a slight tightening around the eyes that Georgia recognized as the recalculation of a man used to getting what he wanted. "I would encourage you to think carefully," Fitch said. "This is a good offer, and I will not be making it twice." "Then we are done here," August said. The 3 men rode out. August watched them go with his hands at his sides and his jaw set. Georgia stood beside him and said nothing until they were out of sight. "He will be back," she said. "I know it," August said. "Do you have the deed?" she asked. He looked at her. "Yes." "You should make sure it is somewhere safe," Georgia said. "And you should register it again at the land office if you have not done so recently. Some of these men find ways around things if the paperwork is not absolutely airtight." August looked at her for a moment with an expression she was coming to recognize, the one where he was recalibrating something in his understanding. "You know about that?" "I have read every newspaper that has come through this house in 6 weeks, Georgia said. "There have been 3 stories about land disputes in the territory in that time, and I pay attention." He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "I will ride to Caldwell tomorrow. Would you come? I would value your opinion on the land agent." She went. They rode into Caldwell together the following morning, and August, had the deed reviewed and properly re-registered at the land office. And Georgia watched the land agent with the careful attention she brought to everything, and afterward told August that the man seemed straight and honest, and that the paperwork was solid. It was on the ride back to the ranch that the thing between them began to shift in a way that neither of them quite acknowledged out loud. They were going through the cottonwood grove along the creek, the horses moving slowly on the soft ground, and the light was coming through the yellowing leaves in that particularly golden way it has in October in Kansas. And Georgia was looking up at it, and August was watching her look up at it. And she turned and caught him looking, and they held that gaze for a moment longer than was practical or casual. And then the horses moved on through the trees, and neither of them said anything. But something had changed, and they both knew it. That night at supper, August asked her what she had done for pleasure before in the Aldrich house, and she thought about it honestly and said she had read whenever she could, and she had liked to walk, and she had once spent 3 entire days making a pie that was not for anyone in particular, simply to see if she could get the crust exactly right. "Did you?" he asked. "Get it exactly right?" "Nearly," she said. "I think I would do it differently now." "Would you make one?" he said. "The pie." She looked at him across the table. "What kind?" "I am not particular," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not about pie at all. "Apple," she said, "if you can get apples." He rode to town the next day specifically for apples. He brought back a whole bushel. She made the pie on a Saturday afternoon, taking her time with it, and the kitchen smelled like cinnamon and warm sugar and browning pastry. And August came in from the barn to wash up for supper and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the pie cooling on the windowsill with an expression of such unguarded pleasure that Georgia had to turn away to the stove to hide the smile that she could not entirely contain. They ate it after supper, at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them, and it was exactly right. The crust was exactly right. And August ate 2 slices and said nothing for a moment, and then he said very quietly, "Georgia." She looked at him. "I am glad you are here," he said. It was a simple thing to say, completely simple, and she felt it go through her from her breastbone to the soles of her feet. "So am I," she said. "Roland Fitch came back in November. He did not come himself this time. He sent one of his men to leave a letter at the ranch, slid under the door on a morning when both August and Georgia had gone to the near pasture to check on a cow that had gone lame. The letter was a legal document with a claim against the property, citing a discrepancy in the original survey of 1879. August read it twice. Then he handed it to Georgia without saying anything. She read it carefully. She turned it over. She read it again. "This is fabricated," she said. "I believe so," August said, "but proving it is another matter." They rode to Caldwell the following day and found a lawyer, a thin, dry man named Harker who practiced out of an office above the hardware store and who had a reputation for honesty that was backed by 15 years in the county. He read the document. He took his time. He asked August several questions about the original purchase, the survey stakes, the witnesses to the deed. Then he looked up and said, "The discrepancy they are claiming does not exist. I can see from the registered documents that the survey in 1879 was done correctly and witnessed by 2 reliable parties. This is a pressure document. Fitch uses them. He sends something that looks official and frightening, and most men, especially those who are not familiar with legal language, simply fold and accept his offer." "I am not most men," August said. "No," Harker said, looking at him over his spectacles. "But Fitch does not know that yet." He looked at Georgia. "You had questions. Go ahead." She had not expected to be invited to ask. She had simply been holding the questions, and now she asked them. She asked about the specific legal statutes around homestead claims and survey discrepancies. She asked about the timeline for responding. She asked about what Fitch could and could not do if August simply ignored the document. Harker answered each one with the methodical precision of a man who respected a well-formed question. When she was done, he said to August, "She is a useful person to have in your corner." "I know it," August said, and he looked at Georgia in a way that made the lawyer glance between them with a small, knowing expression. They filed a formal response through Harker's office and sent a copy directly to the county court. Fitch went quiet after that. His fraudulent claim dissolved when faced with properly organized documentation, and there were no further approaches from his men through the rest of November and into December. December in Kansas arrived with cold that was serious and purposeful. The first snow came on a Tuesday, soft and thick, and Georgia stood at the kitchen window in the early morning and watched it settle over the prairie, and felt a happiness that was so unfamiliar it took her a moment to recognize what it was. She was making Christmas preparations, which she had never been permitted to do in the Aldrich house, where all such things were managed by Vera. She cut pine boughs from the trees along the creek and arranged them on the mantelpiece. She made a wreath from dried grasses and winter berries. She baked. She baked bread and spice cake and molasses cookies and a second pie, this time with dried peaches that August had found at the mercantile and brought home with the quiet self-consciousness of a man who has done something he hopes will please someone and is not certain whether to admit it. He admitted it, eventually, in the barn on a cold afternoon when she had come to bring him coffee, and found him working on a piece of harness leather with a knife that was beginning to go blunt. "I got the peaches on purpose," he said, not looking up from the leather, "because of what you said about making pie." "I know," she said. She handed him the coffee. "I was glad of it." He looked up then. The light in the barn was low and warm from the single lantern hanging on the post, and it caught the angles of his face and made him look like something from a painting, or like someone you would find in a painting, because someone felt the need to capture that particular quality of face in that particular quality of light. Georgia held his gaze and did not look away. "Georgia," he said. "August," she said. They stood there for a moment in the cold, quiet barn with the horses shifting in their stalls and the snow coming down outside, and then he reached out and very carefully tucked a loose strand of her hair back behind her ear, and his hand was warm and rough from the leather work, and she felt that single touch down to the center of her bones. "I do not want to make your situation uncomfortable," he said, his voice low and careful. "You came here to work, and I do not want you to feel any obligation or any pressure. I want you to know that." "I know that," she said. "That is partly why." He did not immediately understand. Then he did. She watched him understand, watched the careful restraint in his face give way to something much simpler and much more honest, and he said, "Georgia, I think I have been falling in love with you since you walked into the street and stopped my horse." She felt her whole self become very still and very warm and very certain. "I think I have been falling in love with you since you told me what I wanted to do was the thing that mattered," she said. He kissed her. It was slow and careful and completely certain, and her hands came up and gripped the front of his coat, and the horses did not care at all, and the snow kept falling outside, and Georgia Brooks, who had never owned anything of her own, stood in a barn in December and felt something take root in her chest that she understood was going to grow into something permanent and enormous and entirely hers. They were careful with it after that. Georgia was a practical woman and August was a practical man, and they both understood that the situation on the ranch had a particular social delicacy to it. They did not move fast. They sat together in the evenings by the fire and talked the way they had always talked, and they rode together to check the cattle in the mornings, and sometimes their hands touched when they passed things at the table and neither of them pulled away. And sometimes in the evening, he would reach over and take her hand and they would sit like that, just sit like that, with the fire going and the wind outside and the warmth between them solid and real and growing. He proposed to her on Christmas morning. She had not expected it, though later she would reflect that she perhaps should have, given everything. She had come downstairs to start breakfast and found him already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a small object in front of him on the wood, waiting with the patience of a man who has been up since before light. The object was a ring. It was a simple thing, a thin gold band with a single small turquoise stone, and he had ridden to Caldwell 3 days before to buy it, which she had not known, which he had managed with the particular discretion of a man determined not to ruin a surprise. "I have been thinking about how to say this properly," he said. He was looking at her with a directness that was completely unguarded. "And then I thought that the proper way is probably just the honest way." "Yes," Georgia said. He blinked. "Yes," she said again, and she was laughing just a little at his expression. "I said yes before you asked because I knew what you were going to ask and the answer was going to be yes, and I did not see the point in making you work your way through the entire sentence." August Hunter looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed. He laughed the way he did not often let himself laugh, fully and without restraint, and the sound of it filled the kitchen, and she thought it was the best sound she had ever heard in her life. He stood up and put the ring on her finger and kissed her, and then he held her face in both hands and said, very quietly, "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you have things that are yours." She pressed her palm flat against his chest. "You are the thing I want," she said. "The rest is extra." They married in January in the small church in Caldwell, on a day when the sky was so blue it looked like something painted. The minister was a decent man named Reverend Caleb, who had married half the county and understood the gravity of what he was doing. There were perhaps 20 people in the pews, various townspeople who had come to know Georgia in her years in Caldwell, and a few of August's neighboring ranchers and their wives. Harker the lawyer was there, standing in the back with his hat in his hands, and an expression that suggested he approved. Georgia wore her good dress, the dark blue one that she had made over herself in November, taking it apart and resewing it in a better cut, adding a bit of cream lace at the collar that she had found at the mercantile. She carried a small bunch of dried winterberries because fresh flowers were not possible in a Kansas January, and she thought they were more honest anyway, these tough, persistent things that kept their color through the cold. August cleaned up in ways that confirmed the promise she had already seen in him. He stood at the altar in a dark coat and a clean shirt, and he watched her walk down the aisle with an expression of such unabashed tenderness that 2 of the women in the pews were openly weeping before she had even reached him. She reached him. He took her hands. "You are beautiful," he said quietly, just for her. "You are going to make me cry in public," she said, "and I refuse to do that." He smiled. "You are going to have to get used to being told you are beautiful, Georgia Hunter, Georgia Hunter." She held that name in her chest and felt it settle there like it had always been meant to be there. After the service, there was a small celebration at the hotel, where the owner's wife had put out food and someone had produced a fiddle, and people danced on the cleared floor of the dining room, and Georgia danced with August, which she had not done since she was a child, and she found that she was remarkably good at it, or perhaps simply that dancing with someone who knew what he was doing made anyone look good. They drove home in the wagon in the late afternoon, with the sun going flat and orange over the prairie, and the cold coming down clean and clear around them, and August put his arm around her on the bench, and she leaned into his side, and they drove the 12 miles back to the ranch in a silence that was the most complete and comfortable silence she had ever experienced. The spring of 1883 transformed the ranch in ways that felt to Georgia like the outward expression of something that had already transformed on the inside. She attacked the kitchen garden with a serious and systematic plan she had been developing all winter, reading everything she could find about what grew well in this part of Kansas, writing out rotations and layouts in a small notebook she kept by the lamp. By April, she had turned twice the square footage of the previous kitchen garden and planted beans and squash and tomatoes and corn, and a small herb bed along the southern wall of the house where it would get the most sun. August expanded the herd, buying 12 more head from a rancher to the north who was selling out. He also took on a regular hired hand, a young man of 20 named Pete Navarro, whose family had come up from Texas several years back, and who was as comfortable on horseback as he was on solid ground. Pete was good-natured and hardworking, and had an easy laugh that Georgia found she enjoyed as a sound in the yard. The ranch felt different with 3 people moving through it. It felt alive in a way that a single person living alone cannot make a place feel, no matter how much they work at it. There was noise and purpose, and the smell of things growing and cooking, and all of it together made Georgia understand, for the first time in her life, what a home actually felt like. Not a place you stayed, a place that was yours. One morning in May, Georgia was in the barn collecting eggs from the nest the hens had made in the corner stall when she heard Pete and August talking outside, the low, easy conversation of men working, and she heard Pete say, "You want to know what I notice about this place since you two got married?" She could not hear August's response clearly, just the tone of it, amused and questioning. "It smells better," Pete said, "is what I notice." That and everything got fixed. She smiled into the straw and collected her eggs. The summer was good. It was a working summer, full of long hot days and the particular satisfaction of hard labor producing real results. The garden grew with an enthusiasm that Georgia had encouraged, and the kitchen was full of things she was putting up in jars for winter. The cattle were doing well. The hay cutting went smoothly. In the evenings, August and Georgia sat on the porch the way they always had, but now there was a difference to it. He would come and find her in the garden sometimes, and stand there in the late afternoon light watching her work with an expression that she caught sometimes when she looked up, and that she had no word for in any language she knew, except perhaps the word love, which seemed too small for the thing she saw in his face. And she knew, because she was not a foolish or deluded person, that something very close to the same thing was on her own face when she looked at him. One August evening, as the month turned, she told him that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, after supper, with the lamp burning between them on the table. She had been certain for 2 weeks and had been holding the certainty close, turning it over, making sure she understood what she felt about it. What she felt was joy, which surprised her in its size and simplicity. August went still when she said it, completely still. And then he was around the table and he had her face in his hands and he was looking at her with an expression so raw and open that she had to close her eyes for a moment. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you happy? Tell me what you need." "I am very well," she said. "I am very happy." She opened her eyes. "And what I need is for you to sit back down because your supper is getting cold." He did not sit back down. He kissed her instead, thoroughly, and held her for a long time, and the supper got quite cold indeed. The autumn brought the baby, and the baby was a boy. They named him James after August's father, which felt right to August in a way that went beyond the symbolic, as if naming the boy for the difficult, complicated man who had taught him everything about land and cattle and stubbornness was a way of making peace with all of it. James arrived in late October in a room full of lamplight, with the capable assistance of the midwife from Caldwell, a sturdy woman named Mrs. Clara Webb, who had delivered half the county and brought a calm authority to the whole, proceeding that Georgia found enormously steadying. August paced the hallway with a dedication that suggested he was personally attempting to wear a groove in the floorboards. When Mrs. Webb opened the door and told him he could come in, he crossed the room in 3 steps and stood over the bed where Georgia lay holding the small wrapped bundle, and he looked at his son's face, and Georgia watched something happen in August Hunter's expression that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, some deep and fundamental rearrangement of everything he was. "Hello," he said to the baby, very softly, as if meeting someone important and wanting to make a good impression. James blinked his dark newborn eyes. "He has your eyes," Georgia said. "He has your mouth," August said. "That's much more important. Your mouth says the right things." She laughed, and the baby startled at the sound and then seemed to settle into it as if he recognized it. They brought James through his first winter with the attentive thoroughness of parents who are determined to do this correctly, which is to say they were exhausted and besotted, and completely unable to put the child down even when he was sleeping, because he was simply too remarkable to be anywhere but held. Pete Navarro took on more of the daily ranch work without being asked, with the undemanding generosity of a good person who understands when a thing needs doing. Georgia felt grateful for him in a way that she expressed primarily by making sure his portion at the table was always the largest. Spring came again, and James discovered grass and became very invested in the concept of dirt, which he felt needed to be in his fists at all times. August took to bringing him into the barn in the mornings and letting him sit in the straw while the horses were tended, and the boy was not afraid of the animals at all, which August seemed to consider a personal victory. It was in the spring of 1884 that Roland Fitch made his final move. He had been quiet for over a year, which Georgia had never fully trusted. Men like Fitch went quiet when they were rearranging, not when they were gone. And she had been right, because what arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning was not a fraudulent legal document this time, but something more direct. A man from the county assessor's office with a notice of back tax assessment that claimed August owed a significant sum on a parcel of the land that had supposedly been improperly included in the original purchase. The amount was large enough to be serious. Not ruinous, but serious. Georgia read the notice. She turned it over. She read it again. "This is Fitch," she said. "Undoubtedly," August said. "He has someone in the assessor's office," she said. "Or he has someone who is willing to be someone in the assessor's office when the price is right." They went to Harker. Harker read the notice and then sat for a long time with it in his hands, and then he said, "I am going to need to see the original survey again, and I am going to need to file a formal dispute within 30 days. I am also going to write to the Kansas State Attorney General's office, because there have been enough incidents of this kind involving Roland Fitch in this county that the pattern is worth documenting." "Do it," August said. "All of it," Georgia said. "And I would like a copy of everything you file." Harker looked at her. "Of course," he said. "The dispute took 3 months to fully resolve. There were letters and responses and counterfilings, and one afternoon in the county courthouse, where Georgia sat in the gallery with James on her lap and watched August and Harker present their case to a circuit judge, who had the weathered look of a man who had seen every version of this particular scheme and was thoroughly tired of it. The judge ruled in August's favor. He went further than that. He ordered an investigation into the assessor's office, and 2 months later that investigation produced enough evidence of Fitch's interference with county records that the man was formally charged with fraud and land manipulation. He left the county before he could be arrested, and no one in Caldwell was sorry to see him go. The day the final papers came from Harker's office confirming that the matter was closed and all claims against the Hunter Ranch were dismissed, August rode into Caldwell to collect them and came home in the late afternoon and found Georgia in the garden with James toddling beside her on the uneven ground, and he came through the gate and said her name and she turned, and he was holding the papers in his hand. She straightened up. James immediately sat down in the dirt and began his research. August walked to her and he said, "It is done, all of it. Legally airtight, every last corner confirmed and sealed." She nodded. She felt the relief of it move through her, clean and final. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded document, a different one, not the papers from Harker. He held it out to her. She took it and unfolded it. It was the deed to the ranch, not a copy. The original deed, registered and witnessed, the primary document of ownership for the 160 acres of Hunter land in the county. She read it and she read it again, and then she looked up. "I had Harker draw up a new registration," August said. His voice was quiet and completely steady. "The deed is in both our names. Your name is on it. This land is yours as much as it is mine. Equal, exactly equal. And I want you to hold on to it." She looked down at the deed again, at the words in their careful formal print, at her name, Georgia Hunter, née Brooks. They're on the document in the same ink as everything else, as permanent as everything else. She had never owned anything of her own. Not a room, not a dress that had been chosen for her, not a single piece of earth. And here was this man, this particular man who had watched her stop a runaway horse on a dusty street, and had asked her what she wanted, and had listened to every answer. handing her a piece of paper that said that 160 acres of Kansas grassland, and a house with a repaired porch and a kitchen garden, and a creek that ran good most of the year, and a barn where a boy named James was learning not to be afraid of horses. All of it was hers. Her hands were not steady. She noticed that she was crying, which she had not planned and which she did not try to stop, because for the first time in her life the thing she felt was large enough to warrant it. "August," she said. Her voice was not steady either. "It is yours," he said simply. "You have always deserved to have something of your own." She pressed the deed against her chest with both hands and closed her eyes for a moment, and then she opened them and looked at her husband, this man she had built something real with from the ground up, and she said, "We built this together." "We did," he agreed. "That's why both our names are on it." James, having completed his investigation of the ground in the immediate vicinity, chose this moment to stand up and toddle purposefully toward them, holding out one dirty fist in the way he had lately of offering his findings to whichever adult was nearest. Georgia crouched and accepted the small clod of earth with the gravity it deserved, and August crouched too, and James lurched between them and grabbed a fistful of each of their shirts with the confidence of a small person who has never doubted his welcome in any place, which is what it looks like when children are raised in a house where they are genuinely wanted. August looked at Georgia over the top of James's head. She looked back. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since the barn in December, and I will love you when we are old and every single day in between. I have loved you since the moment you walked into that road," he said. "But I think I loved you most the moment I understood that you would never need me to take care of you, that what you wanted was someone to stand beside you." She reached out and took his hand, the deed folded safe in her other hand, and the three of them stayed in the garden in the late afternoon light of a Kansas spring, and the creek ran clean in the near distance, and the cattle moved in the far pasture, and the house behind them had a porch with a board that had been repaired by George's own hands and a kitchen that smelled like something good, and none of it was borrowed or temporary or conditional on someone else's goodwill. All of it was theirs. The years that followed had the texture of something well made, something built to last. Not without difficulty, because nothing real is without difficulty, but with the particular solidity of two people who have decided, every single morning, that the thing they have chosen is worth the work of choosing again. James grew into a boy who was afraid of nothing and curious about everything, who followed his father through the barn and the pasture with the focused attention of someone learning a language by immersion, and who followed his mother through the garden and the kitchen with the same attention, so that by the time he was 5, he knew the names of every plant Georgia grew and could identify the cattle by their markings from a considerable distance. In the autumn of 1885, Georgia told August they were expecting again. This time she told him in the barn, because she had come to think of that barn as a place where honest things got said, and he reacted much as he had before, which was to have her face in his hands before she had finished her sentence. This baby was a girl, born in the summer of 1886. They named her Me, after George's mother, whose full name had been Mary but who had gone by Me her whole life, and Georgia found that naming the daughter for the mother she had lost, so young, was a way of bringing something forward through time, carrying the woman she had never had enough time with into a future that was bright and open and full of possibility. Me was a small, fierce person from her first day on earth, with George's dark eyes and a cry that could apparently be heard from the near pasture, which Pete reported with great admiration. August held her for the first time with the careful wonder of a man who knows that he is holding something both fragile and indestructible, which is what a new person always is. James regarded his sister with the cautious interest of a 5-year-old, who is not yet certain whether this development is an asset or a liability, and then Me grabbed his finger and refused to let go, and the question was resolved. Pete Navarro had become, over the years, something that was not quite hired hand and not quite family, and was in fact precisely its own thing, which is the particular bond that forms between people who have weathered real things together. He had his own small cabin on the eastern edge of the property now, which August had helped him build in the winter of 1884, and he ran the south pasture as if it were his own responsibility, which in every practical sense it was. His younger sister, Rosario, had come up from Texas the previous year and was working in Caldwell at the dressmaker's shop and had taken to riding out to the ranch on Sundays, which Pete was deeply casual about and which everyone else was deeply aware of. The ranch grew. Not extravagantly, not in the way of men who want empires, but in the honest way of people who are building something worth leaving behind. August bought an additional 40 acres to the east in 1886, land that had good water and good grass, and that extended the property to what felt like its natural boundary. He and Pete built a second barn, larger than the first, and expanded the cattle operation to the point where they were bringing a respectable number to the market drives each fall. Georgia's kitchen garden had long since outgrown its original dimensions. She grew enough to supply the household with preserved food through the winter and had begun selling the excess at the Caldwell market, which brought in a modest but reliable income that she kept in a separate account at the town bank in her own name, because August had suggested it and she had agreed immediately, because a woman with her own money is a woman with her own choices, and they both believed in choices. She had also begun, quietly, to be the person that neighboring women came to when they had questions about their own situations, because word had gotten around, in the way that word does in small communities, that Georgia Hunter had successfully faced down Roland Fitch's legal maneuvering and understood the paperwork side of land ownership and could recommend a good lawyer and would not dismiss a concern as trivial. She sat at her kitchen table with women from the surrounding ranches and farms, and sometimes from town, and she listened, and she helped where she could, and she pointed them toward Harker when the situation called for it. And she thought sometimes about the 23-year-old woman with a carpetbag who had sat on a bench, outside the telegraph office not knowing what came next, and she felt something for that woman that was simultaneously tender and proud. The thing about building a life from very little, Georgia had come to understand, is that you know the value of everything in it. You do not take the warm kitchen for granted because you remember the cold. You do not take the full table for granted because you remember hunger. You do not take the solid land under your feet for granted because you remember having nothing. She told James this one evening when he was 6, sitting at the kitchen table while she mended a shirt. She did not tell him the full history because 6 is not the age for all of it, but she told him that there had been a time when she did not have a home of her own, and that the ranch and the house and the land were things she valued enormously because they had not always been there. James listened with the serious face he brought to important things. Then he said, "But you have them now." "I do," Georgia said. "Forever." He said, "Forever," she said. "They are in my name and your father's name. That is what a deed means. It means it is ours." He nodded, satisfied with this answer in the way that children are satisfied with answers that confirm the order of the world as they understand it. Then he said, "Can I look at it?" She went and got the deed from the lockbox where she kept it, along with the other important documents, the land registration, the bank papers, the records of the cattle transactions, all the paperwork of a life built on solid ground. She unfolded it and put it on the table, and he looked at it with his small face very close to the paper. "That's your name," he said, pointing. "Georgia Hunter." "That's my name," she agreed. He looked up at her. "It says it's yours." "It does," Georgia said. He nodded again, deeply satisfied, and went back to looking at the document with the reverent attention of someone who understands that he is looking at something that matters, even if he cannot yet fully articulate why. The summer of 1887 was the summer of the drought, which hit the southern Kansas plains hard and made the work on the ranch a matter of careful management and serious decision-making. The creek dropped to a trickle in August and September, and August had to hire 2 extra hands to haul water for the cattle and to dig a supplementary well in the northeast corner of the property, where Pete had located a water source the previous spring. It was hard. Georgia would not diminish that. The kitchen garden suffered despite her best efforts, and she watched things she had grown from seed wither in the heat with the grief of someone who has put real love into the ground. Several of the neighboring ranchers sold out and left, and she understood the desperation behind those decisions even as she and August looked at each other across the table in the evenings and made the silent agreement that they were not leaving. They stretched the winter supplies. They were careful with everything. She went over the household accounts with the precision of a surgeon and found every economy that could be made without diminishing the essentials. She baked bread from scratch because it was cheaper than buying it. She made soups that stretched small amounts of meat across many meals. She preserved everything she could get her hands on from the garden before the heat took it. August came in one September evening looking more tired than she had seen him in a long time, the specific tiredness of someone carrying the weight of responsibility for other people's livelihoods, and she put supper on the table and sat down and said, "Talk to me." He told her all of it. The full picture, the numbers, the calculations, the concerns about whether they had enough to carry the cattle through the winter if the creek did not come back up. She listened to all of it, and then she told him about the account at the bank. The account in her name, the one she had been putting the market money into. She told him the exact amount, which she had been adding to carefully for 2 years. He looked at her. "It is enough," she said, "to cover the supplemental feed if we need it, and we still have the deed, which means we have the land as collateral if it comes to that, though I do not think it will." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You saved that." "We saved that," she said. "It came from this ranch." Georgia. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she had never found a word for. "Do not look at me like that," she said. "Eat your supper." He ate his supper, but he reached across the table and took her hand first and held it, and the warmth of that was as real and sustaining as anything on the table. They came through the drought. The creek came back up in October with the autumn rains, and the cattle had made it through, and the ranch was intact. And when they added up the winter accounts in January of 1888, they were leaner than they had been in previous years, but solvent and standing. Pete, who had also come through the drought on his own careful management of the south pasture, celebrated by finally asking Rosario to marry him in February, which she accepted, and the wedding in the Caldwell church in March was a celebration of a particular kind, the kind that people have when they have survived something hard together and want to mark the fact of being still here. Georgia wore the dress she had made over the previous autumn, a deep green wool that August had told her made her look like the Kansas prairie in October, which she had decided to take as a compliment. James, now 6½ and possessed of strong opinions about his own appearance, wore his best clothes with the dignity of someone doing an important job. Me, who at 1.5 years was primarily interested in the flowers in the church, was carried by August and managed to pull down a considerable amount of the altar decoration before the ceremony began, which endeared her to everyone present. The years continued to turn. James started school in Caldwell, riding in with August on the mornings when there were errands to run, and coming home with a serious face that gradually became an excited one, as he discovered that he liked learning with a devotion that Georgia recognized as coming from her. He brought home books and read them at the kitchen table in the evenings with the same lamp that his parents sat beside, and Georgia read alongside him sometimes, and the 3 of them, for once Me was old enough to join them, spent evenings at that table that Georgia knew she would carry in her bones for the rest of her life. Me, as she grew, became a force of nature. She was Georgia in the garden, interested in how things grew and why they grew the way they did and what could be made from them. She was August in the barn, fearless and capable and completely at ease with animals that were larger than she was. She was entirely herself everywhere else, which was stubborn and quick, and full of a warmth that she dispensed freely to everyone she cared about, and not at all to people she had decided were unworthy of it. August watched his daughter with a joy that was entirely unguarded. He had no defenses where me was concerned, which me understood at a very early age and did not abuse, because for all her stubbornness, she was also deeply perceptive in the way of children who pay careful attention to the people around them. Georgia watched August with me and thought about the man she had met on a September morning in 1882 who had asked her what she wanted. And she thought about how you can know a person thoroughly and still find new things to love about them, the way a piece of land reveals itself over seasons. There was an evening in the summer of 1889 that Georgia kept coming back to afterward, the way you keep coming back to certain moments not because they were extraordinary in the conventional sense, but because they crystallized something that was always true and that you needed the crystallization of to fully see it. James was 8. Me was 3. Pete and Rosario were over for supper, which happened most Sunday evenings now. The table expanded with an extra leaf to fit everyone. The food was Georgia's, as always, a roast chicken and summer vegetables from the garden and cornbread and preserves, and the kitchen was full of the kind of noise that means people who like each other are in the same room at the same time. At some point in the evening, me climbed into August's lap and promptly fell asleep against his chest, and he sat there for the rest of the meal with one arm around the sleeping child and ate with the other hand, and carried on a conversation with Pete about the fence line on the east pasture, with the complete equanimity of a man for whom this was simply the texture of his life. Georgia looked at him from across the table. He met her eyes. He was so familiar to her by then. Every line of his face, every quality of his voice, every expression in the vocabulary of expressions that only belonged to him. She knew how he took his coffee and how he moved through the barn in the morning and the sound of his boots on the stairs at night, and the way he looked when he was worried, and the way he looked when he was happy, and the way he looked at her, which was, still, after 7 years, with that particular quality of attention that made her feel entirely seen. She loved him so completely that it was not a feeling that came and went. It was a condition. A permanent quality of her interior landscape, like the creek on the north boundary, like the eastward-facing window in the room that was hers. He was still looking at her. He raised an eyebrow slightly, a question. She shook her head, not a negative, more like an answer to a question that had not quite been asked aloud. Everything, all of this. Yes. He nodded once, understanding her completely, and returned to the conversation with Pete. In the spring of 1890, Georgia went to the lockbox and took out the deed, which she did sometimes. Not because she doubted it was there, because she liked to look at it. Because something in her had been shaped so deeply by having nothing that the proof of having something still moved her, even after years. She unfolded it on the kitchen table in the morning light. The paper had gotten soft at the fold lines from handling. The ink was still clear. Her name was still there. Georgia Hunter, née Brooks. August came into the kitchen, saw her at the table with the deed, and did not say anything. He came and stood beside her and looked at it with her. "I think about that day still," she said. "The first time you put it in my hands." "I know you do," he said. "It was the first thing I had ever owned," she said. "Truly owned. In my own name, with my own signature on it." He put his hand on her back. "How does it feel now, after all this time?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything honestly. "It feels like the beginning of everything," she said. "Not the most important thing, because the most important things are you and James and me and the life we have built, but the beginning of understanding that I was allowed to have things, that I was allowed to want things and have them and hold on to them." August was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I put that deed in your hands, I was trying to tell you something." "I know," she said. "I was trying to tell you that you were not a guest here," he said. "That you were not temporary. That this was as much yours as mine, and I wanted it to be legal and solid and undeniable." She folded the deed back along its soft lines and held it in her hands, and then she leaned against her husband's side and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the kitchen in the morning light of a Kansas spring, on their land in their house, with their children asleep upstairs, and the whole day was still ahead of them. "August," she said. "Georgia," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it, for seeing me on that street and asking what I wanted, for the room with the key, for the ring, for putting my name on this paper." She paused. "For James and me, for all the evenings on this porch, for every morning." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Thank you for stopping my horse," he said, "and for everything after." She laughed. It was the laugh of a woman who is happy, not in the fragile way of happiness that depends on circumstances remaining the same, but in the deep and settled way of happiness that has put down roots and knows it is not going anywhere. She put the deed back in the lockbox. She started the coffee. August went out to start the morning chores. James came downstairs soon after, already half-dressed and full of plans for the day, and me came behind him in her nightgown with her hair in absolute rebellion and one small fist rubbing her eye. Georgia made breakfast. She made it with the pleasure she always took in it, in the particular alchemy of turning raw things into something that fed the people she loved. James sat at the table and told me about something he had read the night before, and me listened with the expression she wore when she was pretending not to be interested and was completely interested. August came back in from the barn with the morning cold still on his coat and washed up at the basin and sat down at his place, and the four of them were at the table together. And the kitchen was warm and the coffee was good, and outside the Kansas morning was opening up, vast and blue and full of grass and sky, and the particular beauty of a place that will not be easily forgotten. The years had their turning. More seasons of work and weather, and the small dramas and large joys of a life built on solid ground. James grew into a young man of serious mind, and his father's steadiness, and his mother's ability to ask the right question at the right time. He went to study at a college in Lawrence when he was 17, which was a decision that Georgia supported with her whole heart, and which cost her the specific grief of watching someone you love grow into a person large enough to leave, which is actually the whole point, and which she bore with the dignified practicality of a woman who understands that love is not ownership. Me, for her part, showed every sign of staying on the land with the devotion of someone who has been raised knowing it is hers. She had her father's eye for cattle and her mother's instinct for what the ground needed, and she worked the ranch with a capability that made Pete shake his head in admiring exasperation on a regular basis. Pete and Rosario had their own family by then, 2 boys and a girl, and the Navarro children grew up alongside the Hunter children in the casual intermingled way of families who are not family by blood, but are family by everything that matters. Georgia's 40th birthday came on a Thursday in October of 1899, 17 years after she had stood on the street in Caldwell with a carpetbag and no clear plan. August made her a cake, which was a significant undertaking for a man who was not a baker by nature or inclination, and the result was more earnest than elegant. But she ate 2 pieces and told him it was the best cake she had ever tasted, which was not entirely a lie because she was measuring it by the intention behind it. He had also, and this was August Hunter being precisely the person he had always been, had a new deed drawn up. The property had expanded over the years with the additional eastern acreage and the small parcel they had purchased from a neighbor in 1892, and the deed now reflected the full extent of what the Hunter Ranch had become, which was 240 acres of grassland and creek and barn and house and kitchen garden, and everything that had been built on it, and everything it had built in return. He put it in her hands at the kitchen table on her birthday, and she unfolded it, and it was the same as it had always been. Her name, August Hunter and Georgia Hunter, partners and equals in every line of the document, everything they had made together, named as theirs together. She looked at the deed for a long time. She looked at her name, which she had looked at so many times over 17 years, and she thought about what it had meant to see it the first time and what it meant now, which was not less but was different, deeper, layered with everything that had happened since. Every time, she said, her voice was steady but quiet. Every single time you put this in my hands, I feel it. Good, he said simply. She looked up. He was watching her with the same quality of attention he had always brought to looking at her, unhurried and completely present. His hair had silver in it now, at the temples, and in the beard he had grown the previous winter. The lines of his face were deeper. He was, she thought, more beautiful than she had ever seen him, because beauty accumulates in faces that have been used for living. I love you, she said. August Hunter, I love you in a way I cannot say the size of. He reached across the table and took her hand, the deed between them on the wood. Georgia Hunter, he said, you are the finest thing I have ever known. Outside, the October prairie was going bronze and gold in the afternoon light. The horses moved in the far pasture. The kitchen garden was going to sleep for winter, each plant spent and satisfied with the season. The creek was running clean. The house was solid around them, every repair made with care, every room used and loved. In the room that had been hers since the first day, the room with the window that faced east, the key still hung on its hook beside the door. She had never lost it. She had never stopped valuing it. A key to a room that was hers. The first thing she had ever been given that was truly, simply, unequivocally hers alone. She folded the deed. She held it. She thought about a girl of 7 whose parents were gone, and a young woman of 23 standing in the street with nothing, and a woman at 40 sitting at her own kitchen table in her own house on her own land with the man she loved, and the deed to prove it and everything else. All the invisible and unenumerable things that could never be written on any document because they lived in her now and they were permanent. She had never owned anything of her own until the cowboy put the deed in her hands. And then, because of what that deed had really been, which was not just paper and ink and a legal record but a declaration, a beginning, a door opened wide and held open, she had gone on to own everything. Every morning, every season, every year. The land and the house and the garden and the children and the whole wide arc of a life that was hers, built with her own hands alongside the hands of a man who had understood, from the first moment, that what she needed was not someone to take care of her but someone to stand beside her and call it equal. She put the deed back in the lockbox. She locked it. She went to the stove to start supper. August got up from the table and stood behind her and put his arms around her and rested his chin on the top of her head. And they stood there in the kitchen of the house that was theirs, on the land that was theirs, in the life that was theirs. And the sun went on going down over the Kansas prairie in its same unhurried way, the same as it had on the morning she had stood in the street with her carpetbag. And everything was different, and everything was exactly as it should be, and it was enough. And it was more than enough, and it would last.